first saw Blade Runner when I was 15. Well, I'd seen a large chunk of it on cable as a kid when I was 10 or so. This version.
Sushi. That's what my ex-wife called me. Cold fish.
I fell in love with the Maltese Falcon-style narration over science fiction instantly, but never got to see the whole thing. Then, a few years later, in '92, a director's cut came out on Laserdisc. I was 11 and no one I knew had a Laserdisc player, so it wasn't until '96 that I got to see it from beginning to end, this time without the voiceover, because that wasn't really Scott's intention. I missed it though. The anachronism was part of the brilliance. Without it, and without the majesty of a theater, there are parts that seem sleepy and empty, atmospheric but redundant. Still, by the end, I was in tears and couldn't have told you why exactly. I ended up preferring the director's cut overall because that tacked-on happy ending being gone made it a much better film, but I still missed that bogey voiceover. And this was still there. The opening crawl. Other than Star Wars, opening text is usually tacked on at a studio's behest. It ruins the suspense of the cold open because executives mistake suspense for anxiety. But here was a supposed director's cut, and it was still there, still explaining the plot while creating strange plot holes. The replicants are stronger and smarter than humans? Who would do that? Even if it was necessary, it's an obviously bad idea and a super weak foundation for a man versus technology story. Never mind that idiots are currently running robotics. In '96, when Terminator 2 and Skynet were a fresh memory, this seemed like an impossible mistake that no one would make. Later, I'd find out this cut was a studio approximation of Scott's vision, and I thought, oh, that explains it. If he ever puts out a real cut of his own, it won't have that text. But then I got the final cut. No voiceover, unicorn dream, proper ending. Yet there it was, that opening crawl. So really meant to do this? As the film progressed before my now 26-year-old eyes, the story told in Blade Runner, and thus the need for the opening crawl, came into full relief. Deckard is not the hero of Blade Runner, merely the protagonist. And our protagonist in this film is the villain, redeemed by our actual hero, only in the final reel. Blade Runner isn't about man versus technology at all. It's about race. Specifically, how it feels to be black in America. Philip K. Dick, author of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the book whose world and themes Blade Runner liberally adapts, was known for an obsession with reality and perception. He infamously was hooked on amphetamines and did hallucinogens regularly, which caused or exacerbated some schizotypal personality traits, and was a proponent of his own kind of simulation theory, only understood in the least by scholars of his work.
A plurality of overlapping Earths along whose linking axis a person can somehow move, can travel in a mysterious way from worse to fair to good to excellent. Contemplating this in theological terms, perhaps we could say that herewith we suddenly decipher the elliptical utterances which Christ expressed regarding the kingdom of God, specifically where it is located.
He was also writing in the 1960s and 70s, during the Civil Rights Movement and Watergate. His books delve subjects only truly understandable from this vantage. Paranoia, drugs, policing, race riots, schizophrenic realities, and synesthetic empathy all play paramount roles in his books, as they did in his life. Dick wrote a speech in 1978 entitled How to Build a Universe Without It Falling Apart 2 Days Later, in which he describes a series of crises and coincidences while writing his novel Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, having to do with Jesus, the Nixon administration, the Ichthus, all in 1974. He told an Episcopalian priest about his experiences despite not being religious. He tells the priest the end of the book where Felix, the police chief, meets a black man at a gas station, has an interaction, and flies off, only to return to hug the stranger and talk to him. The priest notes its similarity to chapter 6 of Acts of the Apostles, where an apostle also named Philip meets a black Ethiopian man in a chariot and helps him understand a gospel. In 1977, Phil would meet a black man, aid him, and leave, only to return to help him reach a gas station. The connection to Flow My Tears would only occur to him afterward. In some ways, Blade Runner is an adaptation of Electric Sheep, but in other important ways, it adapts this defining moment in Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, and Dick's life. While Taverner of Flow My Tears is a pop star that wakes up in a world where he does not exist, the police chief, Felix, is who has final authority the entire book, and then ends up having the emotional encounter with the black man in a world where black people are almost extinct, essentially due to the police. The book version of Deckard wakes to a world where his memories may all be implants and is forced to question his humanity while he hunts robots. The focus on this is skewed by screenwriters Hampton Fancher and David Peoples in favor of making the viewer instead question the mechanical nature of the replicants, and uses their humanity to humble Deckard instead. Both are about waking a police officer to the reality of his profession and blurring the line between the hunter and hunted in a sort of science-fictional version of Artemis and the Deer Hunter. Dick very specifically, other than in the title, never calls the robots anything special like Android. They are robots. The word robot, meanwhile, has its roots in a Czech science fiction play in which Rossum's universal robots are artificial beings created to do work for humanity. Robotnik in the Czech means slave.
Do you even know what robot means?
Of course I do. It's like, hello, I am a robot.
It means slave. Believe me, they're not slaves.
Slavery did not begin with American slavery. It did not begin with the African slave trade. Slavery was once the norm, so commonplace that there were degrees of it, from the full harsh torture we most often depict, all the way to services performed for free to repay a debt. Traditional marriage lands somewhere in the middle. A shepherd sells his daughter along with some sheep in exchange for money, land, or political expediency. This is our past, but don't mistake it for our nature. Our original state, in what for our purposes we will call the Archaic Era, i.e. prehistory, was relatively egalitarian and power was shared, often held exclusively by women, and sometimes oscillated seasonally. Slavery is, however, how we unnaturally organized for thousands of years in the ancient era or the earliest written records. Writing, inventory, administration, the modern state, and enslaving and selling people all emerging at once is not a coincidence, but that might be for another video. There is a way of looking at the slave trade that we don't want to do, and that's what True Neutral is for, so let's get right to it. The Dutch slave trade was not the invention of slavery, but of the middle class. The evolution of the tribal culture with open borders to closed tribes to conquering tribes with administrative complexes to deal with the spoils of conquest, including surviving populations of those conquered. Each of these early cultures had a slave class or caste, a group who by accident of birth or fortune ended up bound to a higher caste family. They who in the modern West would be the unhoused or homeless population would instead be forced into or forced to seek the refuge of servitude under a master to pay off debt or simply because their social caste dictated they were slaves, as is the case with all women at the time and foreign prisoners of war. It is these people who were originally sold to European settlers in exchange for goods, mostly weapons, to fight off but eventually to conquer their neighbors. The ensuing arms race caused African nations who did not consider their neighbors the same race, and thus less human, to steal people from their enemy and eventually neighboring tribes or nations to feed their addiction to weaponry. In Europe, meanwhile, the slave trade promoted the slave class to a class between slave and noble. Slaves could now be bought from other countries, a form of free trade. This meant the lowest of their citizens could own their own slave potentially. And so every so-called civilized nation of the world from Europe to India up to the 19th century owned African slaves, but they were traditionally castrated. So as these nations illegalized slavery, their slave-descended populations dwindled to nothing. Everywhere except the nation whose industriousness, individuality, and self-made impulse was a point of pride, the United States. Here the attitude of why buy foreign takes on a sinister overtone. In order to acquire slaves who were not castrated and thus could make more slaves for free, they had to steal African citizens into slavery. The American slave traders then manufactured their new product. In other words, they force-bred people for different traits like strength, agility, and genetic health, and then through a process of unnatural selection incidentally for talent and cunning. After all, any who were not strong and agile enough would have to possess value, and of the intelligent, only those who could hide their intellects would last. Stronger, faster, and smarter. Made in America, as it were. It is here where race, once synonymous with nationality and breed, see the Roman race, takes on Darwin's species meaning, because the dehumanization of the slave nationality and caste becomes necessary for the wealthy to commit their crimes, and because the states have destroyed the previous national race concept. Likewise, the new race becomes a dependency for elevated poor Europeans, who need to believe in something that makes them unenslavable. The term liberty evolves directly from this need to draw a line between the enslavable and a class that was not merely free, but that had been liberated by the enslavement of others. In aristocratic England, having a job at all was considered low class, including things we hold in esteem now, such as doctors or lawyers. In the north and west of Europe, darker skin tones were commonly seen as signs of lower caste or class. This is where the term redneck originates, from the tan a working-class European would get from working outside in fields. To someone indoctrinated into this culture, Africans would seem made to work outside. White, meanwhile, begins as a racial slur for the English Quakers, who were pale and religiously generous, hence the phrase mighty white of you when someone does a fair deal. Quakers would eventually, deservedly or not, become associated with other forms of isolationist, ascetic Protestantism, such as the Dutch Anabaptist movements, like the Mennonites and Amish, who were predominantly Dutch, making them white as well. The Dutch, of course, with their East India Trade Company, revolutionized the slave trade and made it what we know of today.
There are only two things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Dutch.
So the Dutch race, or the white race, was by definition unenslavable. Soon all Protestants with pale skin, either from wearing large hats or not working in the sun due to slaves in their fields, would be white in America. During segregation, the word Creole, which means local, comes to signify a specific type of mixed black person in the French colonies, where free blacks occurred more frequently and intermingled with lower caste Europeans such as Irish and Italian, and where black people had been inducted into the Louisiana Choctaw for decades. These black people often not only developed lighter skin tones, but occasionally wavy, loose hair and lighter eye colors, allowing them to passer blanc, or pass for white. Many chose to, sometimes abandoning darker-skinned family, or that family might force them to leave for greener pastures due to the perceived luck of their recessive traits. The police begin first as groups of criminals called Pinkertons, who after stealing from the wealthy would offer to retrieve their valuables at a premium, which of course includes runaway slaves, the most expensive commodity people had. In the US, every few decades, a new ethnic group, what would have been a race prior to the American experiment of an immigrant nation with no locals, is inducted into the white race, just as black people begin to grow in either population or rights, so that blacks cannot gain political power. The only people who cannot be white, of course, are blacks. This is why they cannot be pink people and brown people. It's about opposition. This also creates the fear of a black rise, because black cannot rise without tipping white back down to the bottom of the spectrum. There were abolitionists on both sides of the Mason-Dixon who recognized the humanity of slaves, but they were not the norm, and you would not have been one of them. At best, you would be Deckard, someone who has normalized their suffering as a part of his life, maybe quit the job because you lost the stomach for it, but can be forced back using the vaguest of threats. How do I know this? Because it's who we both are right now, as slavery has not vanished, merely been outsourced. Once again, the structure of the slave class changed, elevating the poor of every other so-called race beyond it. Who built the phone in your hand right now, or the computer and its desk you sit at? The shoes on your feet, the roof on your house. If it wasn't made in America, Britain, or Japan, I have bad news for you about your place in history. The discomfort we feel with Deckard's actions and mindset is more than the discomfort of a hero being mistaken at the start of a film. It is the mindset of the person actively harming people in his world through a fundamental lack of understanding of reality, i.e. a villain. The reason his behavior is uncomfortable and tragic, the reason the ending resonates deeply even if you don't quite get it, and significantly more if you do, and the reason Deckard's origins matter is not because of some postmodern plot twist or cool sci-fi trope. They are direct confrontations of the relationship of the police, race, and slavery. Deckard is an ex-slave catcher. The off-world colonies are the Wild West in the South, where slavery in the form of androids is expanding the human race's footprint in space. That makes Earth, with its megacities and lack of natural resources, the northeastern original colonies. The presence of runaway slaves for them is inconvenient. Rachel, the first Nexus 6 Deckard meets, is Passé Blanc, raised white by a slave trader. The slave trader. Deckard runs the Voight-Kampff test on her, designed to test for empathic human emotional responses, and it takes a very long time to spot it. Who knows if this test is legitimate or simply another bigoted construct? Any parent can tell you it takes every human about 5 years to develop the full range of human empathy, to not only know that they are separate from their parents, but to realize others, who are also separate from their parents, feel pain. Add a little more time if they are raised in an inhuman way. Maybe they never figure it out. The 5-year lifespan of a replicant, then, is meant to prevent them from developing naturally, as we all do. It's not circuitry that keeps them from humanity, but time. Rachel's privileged human life and false memories of growing up have allowed her to develop at a less stunted pace than, say, Pris. At an allegorical level, the Voight-Kampff represents a purity test of blood or pedigree or ideology, inherently designed to make subjective criteria for something appear objective and scientific. Define human as having something, design a test to demonstrate when a person lacks that something or has elements of something else that you decide is the opposite, but you've rigged the test because your definition of human already excluded those people. Your opinion of race, therefore, is based on an impossibility, that anyone can be pure. Either way, when later Rachel asks,
"You know that Voight-Kampff test of yours? Did you ever take that test yourself?"
it is not some clever plot twist. This is not, "He's a ghost, gotcha." This is, how do you know you're not passing? The point isn't to answer or even to discuss this question, but to question ourselves and the frameworks through which we view the world. While the robot's potential superiority points directly to the insecurity that manifests in so-called white supremacy movements, the replicant's replicated nature blurs those lines and questions the very idea of race. While you're worried they are better than you, comforting yourself with a fantasy about how you are superior, you may be one of them yourself. 2049 continues this work masterfully. Villeneuve has continuously proven himself to have a deep understanding of source materials and to be exceptional at adapting their core meanings. He deftly balances not answering questions such as Deckard's race, which would nullify the earlier film's impact, while bringing in unadapted ideas from Electric Sheep, all while continuing to hug the allegory of American race relations and how they inform the institution of the police. The idea of replicants reproducing on their own accord being a threat to human hegemony, the beginning of black police officers and how they would be treated and seen by both sides, and of empathy being the key to awakening, all bring the original's allegory up to date without altering its meaning. Continuing the pattern of the prior film, rather than sticking with a changed Deckard and possibly undoing his evolution in order to make an interesting plot, we instead find a new villain who is unaware he is the bad guy. Kay knows he's a replicant and hunts his own kind to survive, and probably in rational senses to himself, in a broader way to pave some sort of path for his people toward acceptance. But he's a race traitor to other nexuses, a machine replacement to his coworkers, and a useful idiot to his superior, not to be trusted from any of those perspectives. Kay's wife is a secondary, more AI-based and technological robot. In the allegory of this world, this makes her a different minority with a similar place in the hierarchy, perhaps even lower. One could view her as a female African-American, but there have been female replicants, and this doesn't really jive. In the turn-of-the-century allegory, we find ourselves in a hologram with overly obedient traits groomed in by a patriarchal program, a hologram who can't touch anything, has no power or agency whatsoever, and the literal rail she is tied to that he's saving up to free her from reads closer to Chinese slave, related in plight, but not kin proper. Criticisms of Kay's owning of a slave as hypocritical once again confuses protagonism with heroism and ignores the symbolism. We are not meant to model Kay's behavior, but empathize with it. Sure, he's purchased her, but he's also saving up to buy her freedom and autonomy. He's trying to give her a real life, and in treating her as a real person, he has to assume her emotions to be real in order to assume his own are. From her perspective, having a good man who understands being artificial and is not cruel and does not treat her like property means her love has the option of not being performative, something not true for her sisters in other houses, to be sure. We see her ambitions for her kind, his kind, herself, and her lover emerge throughout. Assuming everything she does and says is artificial or under orders is to assume she is not real and has no say, which ignores the allegory so-called artificial intelligences play in this world, that not of the inhuman, but of the dehumanized. And here we find the real point. Confusion over how a being made clearly of flesh and bone, indistinguishable from human, in fact, only kept from humanity by a lifespan so short they won't arrive at full emotional development, could be considered a robot at all. The point is that there is no difference despite their selected traits. If you have empathy, you are human, and if you're human, you deserve empathy. If you do not have it yet, you still deserve it and the right to mature toward it. The concept of the separation and dehumanization of two different types of people is the evil to be overcome. By the end, the film takes a traitor fully to the place of revolutionary martyr via empathy with that which must be saved. A hybrid/born citizen, in other words a Creole, who happens to be the personification of empathy, mercy, and kindness. Fragile and helpless, with her fate in the hands of a conflicted black cop. As Roy hits his lifespan's limits, he has begun to develop the emotional responses his creators feared. At first, he had lashed out like a toddler with an adult body might, with fits of violence that have repercussions he cannot truly fathom because he has emotions but has not yet recognized them in others. This is all a violent sociopath really is, a maladjusted toddler who can kill during a tantrum. As he mourns Pris and hunts Deckard, he appears to go mad, but this is the dawning of empathy as he begins to shut down. He stops simply being angry and entitled and grows funny, playful, imaginative, and most importantly, sad. He contextualizes his life with the man he hunts. He becomes fully human, and in that moment does what Deckard cannot, sees himself in the dangling man desperately clinging for his life. Saving him is letting go of his own ledge. It is cherishing the sanctity of what he once jealously coveted and surpassing his hunter in maturity all at once.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
And in that flash, he has ironically elevated Deckard, either through allowing him to realize he's been the villain all along, or by demonstrating mercy, teaching it to Deckard through the empathic muscle that allows us to learn from one another instead of exclusively through personal experience. The Deckard that returns to Rachel, who he had been so entitled and rough with before, is now a fully human man who takes her with kindness and compassion, and above all, the mercy Roy taught him as he wept in the rain.